Can you hear me in the back? We okay? All right, I always check. Because I do this every Sunday. I have these kind of wireless things. One Sunday I was doing this, and I was right in the middle of the sermon. The guy that jumped up and said, "Hey, I can't hear a word you're saying." And the gentleman who was sitting right here in the front, he jumped up and said, "I can hear everything. Let's switch." So yeah, we always check the sound to make sure we're good. Today is all about temptation. That's where we are. We have these stories of temptation. So I thought that I would bring a little centerfold from a magazine that I have and show you real temptation. There it is, the new Big Bertha driver. Came out of my golf magazine. This is temptation. Okay, maybe not for every one of you, but for me, this is it right here. This driver, if I got this driver, I could hit the golf ball much, much farther. Straighter, better, and it would make a big difference in my life. I need this driver. And you're thinking, he wants that driver so he could be as good as Tiger Woods or Bubba Watson. No, no, no. Not at all. I do not have those kind of aspirations. I just want to be better than my sons. That's all I'm looking for. Just if I could be as good as my old 30-year-old self. And there's the temptation. You see, we are tempted by all kinds of things. Sometimes it's splurging on things that we don't really need. Now, that's not an example. I really do need that driver. But, other things could be like that. But this goes much deeper, these stories, these temptations. These temptations lead us to sin. And we use these words a good bit in the church. Temptation, sin, and ultimately they lead to death. Today's lessons really speak to us on these topics. But sometimes I think we miss the true nature of what's going on in these stories. Because these stories are really a deep understanding about who we are as people, as humanity. What it means to be people, and what it means to be in God's creation. We started with the story of Adam and Eve. And that God created Adam and Eve and placed them in a garden, and things were good. He gave them the garden to keep and to tend. They were the creatures. We are the creatures as human beings that care for God's creation and garden. What happens next is what we call the story of the fall, but I don't really see it as a fall. Sometimes we even characterize it with pride or arrogance, but I don't see those things. I think it really describes what is our human condition. And one of the verses that we did not read today, we kind of skipped through chapter 2, but in verse 25 of Genesis 2, it says that the man and woman were both naked and were not ashamed. We hear that word translated as naked, but in the Hebrew it has a much deeper meaning. It means to be vulnerable or to be exposed. That our human condition is that we are vulnerable. And they in the garden were vulnerable to each other and to God, and they were okay with that. They were weak, not strong. And that's how we are in the world still as human beings, and yet we don't like it much because it makes us dependent. Dependent on others, and more importantly, it makes us dependent on God. And so we define ourselves in many ways by our relationships and by then our dependencies. Think about how you describe yourself. I often describe myself and I would say I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a grandfather. They're all relationships. People who are with me in dependency. And I'm the bishop. And I am in relationship to you. And I'm a child of God. And so I have a relationship with God. And we depend on God. And we are vulnerable. and vulnerable people can be hurt. So what does that crafty serpent say? He says, if you eat of this fruit, you'll know the difference between good and evil, and you will be like God. Then you won't have to depend on God, because you'll be like God. Temptation is believing that you can become something other than the person God created. And what was revealed to Adam and Eve when they ate the fruit? Good and evil, and that they were vulnerable. And they were afraid. And so they covered themselves up in their vulnerability and they hid. And there's the sin. What's sin? Sin is broken relationships. And it comes kind of in two forms. What is our natural reaction always to fear? Fight or flight. So what did Adam and Eve do? They took to flight. They hid. They covered themselves up. They hid in a corner and they said, God, don't hurt us, we're afraid. And the sin of their children? Well, Cain killed Abel. The fight. And we seem like we have been sinning ever since. Why? Because we're afraid. We don't want to be hurt. We don't want to be exposed. We don't want that human reality that we are vulnerable and we are weak. And so we begin to hide. We hide in lies. We tell half-truths so that people don't know who we really are. And we desire things that are not really ours in the hopes that somehow we'll be different. And so we end up stealing and coveting. And the commandments are really just laws from God to help us protect one another from each other in our vulnerability. And we live in a culture that absolutely preys on vulnerability. You're not a good golfer. You're not a good enough golfer. If you just would get a little more, if you could get something more, you'd be better than you are now. And you're getting older and you're not as strong as you used to be. If you buy this golf club, if you take these vitamins, everything will be better for you. Then you'll be able to keep up with the young ones. Each day, we are besieged with advertisements that create for us a sense of lack, a sense of insecurity and inadequacy that undermine our God-given gifts of who we are. With the promises that if you buy this car, this deodorant, this toothpaste, your teeth will be whiter, you will be better, and you will be more loved by people. It is the message in our consumer consumption culture. It is a message simply that you are not enough. You are not skinny enough. You are not smart enough. You are not pretty enough. You are not strong enough. You are not rich enough. You are not young enough to deserve respect and love and acceptance. And here's the thing. It's a lie. It's a demonic lie that exploits us. Because we are the children of God. And we are dependent. We are dependent on God. And the temptation from the demonic forces is that you don't need God. That you can make it on your own, that you can climb up, you can be better, you can be perfect. You can be like God. And it's a lie, and we fall for it over and over again. So sometimes we choose to hide in a false persona, pretending to be someone we're not. Sometimes we just hide with chemicals and alcohol from the reality of life. But the truth is, we're all naked and vulnerable and exposed under our clothes. And I'm not advocating nudity, but I am advocating a love of God and a love of neighbor. And how is it that we live into that? This is where Jesus comes in for the story, to show us a more excellent way, Jesus came into God's creation fully human. And in the beginning of the ministry, he is thrust out into the desert by the Spirit of God, tossed out to face Satan. And the devil shows up and he says, you don't have to suffer like other people. Jesus, you don't have to do that. You can make bread out of nothing. You don't have to be weak. You can be powerful. Just take your power and use it. And Jesus says, I am human. And I am with humanity, and when humanity is hungry, then I am hungry with them. And I rely on my relationship with God. And the devil says to him, I can take you up to the heights and you can be thrown down and you won't be hurt. And Jesus says, I don't use power in that way. The devil says, we can work together, we can change the world and make it just the way you want to. All you have to do is worship with me. And Jesus says, I keep my relationship with God as the central point in my life, dependent on God. In his humanity, in his vulnerability, and not just there, but in all the stories of Jesus' life. He shows his love for humanity, he shows his love for God in everything he does, and in the end, he shows his love and his vulnerability to face even death. And that moving into death, he defeats death itself. He shows that death and sin do not have sway in our lives, and that the lies about the facts that we cannot make it and that we're not good enough somehow, they are lies. We are God's children, each one of us, precious in God's eyes. And we are people of the cross. We don't make ourselves into something that we're not. We find ourselves as beloved children of God and the caretakers of God's creation. And we are vulnerable, but we are not fearful. It's why the angels come in every story. And the first thing an angel says right when they walk into the room is, do not be afraid. We don't run and hide from the realities of life. We step into them with love for God and for one another, and a dependence on a loving God. And we don't fight and use violence and power to crush other people. We reach out in love and trust. And sometimes when we're vulnerable and we reach out in love and trust, we get hurt. Sometimes bad things happen. But ultimately, the forces of evil and death, they have no power over us. What are we afraid of? And more importantly, what does courage look like? Do you know what I think courage looks like? I think courage looks like being in a relationship and being the first one to say, I love you. I think courage is being willing to say, I'm sorry because I was wrong. I think courage is willing to ask for help when we cannot do it on our own. Particularly when we used to be able to do it on our own and we're no longer capable. But we recognize that we are dependent on others. That's courage. You know, I didn't really want to be bishop. I didn't think maybe I had what it takes. Whatever exactly that is, I don't know. It's probably the hardest thing I've ever been called to do. And some days I think maybe I can't figure it out. And that's the devil, that message. You're not good enough. But I was chosen to do this by God's Spirit. And it isn't really about me. It's about God working through me. So I step into this role only knowing that by the grace of God, I can live into this calling. And if it's true for me, it's true for each and every one of you. You are God's beloved. You are God's chosen. And we'll be tempted constantly to be someone we're not. And that somehow through the next purchase, we'll make ourselves into someone that they can't hurt. Or we'll avoid that situation and we'll lie and we'll hide from the thing that we fear. Or we'll strike out and use whatever strength we have to protect our own vulnerability. That is the nature of sin. But God in Christ calls us to be in love with God and to be in love with others. And to be human is to be vulnerable. It's to risk pain. It's to risk ridicule. It's to risk being hurt. It's to risk even death. Just as Christ did. And it is to risk to be who we truly are.